The wind howled like a living beast, sweeping across the vast, snow-covered wilderness. A thick, icy fog clung to the ground, swallowing everything in its path. The sun, though high in the sky, offered no warmth, just a pale, ghostly glow that barely pierced through the storm clouds. Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck, his breath visible in the freezing air. He was a seasoned wildlife rescuer, accustomed to the unforgiving cold, but today felt different. Something gnawed at his instincts, an unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. The radio crackled with static before the dispatcher's voice came through. "We got a distress report. Someone spotted an injured animal near the northern ridge. Could be a bobcat caught in a fence. You're the closest responder." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen too many cases like this. Wild animals ensnared in human-made traps, their powerful bodies helpless against barbed wire or steel snares. Every rescue was a battle against time and the elements. He pressed the gas, the truck's tires crunching over the icy road. Towering pines lined the edges of the frozen landscape, their branches heavy with snow. The deeper he drove into the wilderness, the quieter it became, as if the world itself was holding its breath. After several minutes, he reached the remote ridge. His truck skidded slightly as he parked, the ice making every movement treacherous. He grabbed his emergency kit, slung a thick jacket over his shoulders, and stepped out. The cold bit into his skin immediately, but he ignored it. Then he saw it. Just a few yards ahead, tangled in a cruel mess of barbed wire, lay a massive bobcat. Blood stained the pristine snow beneath it, dark red against white. The animal's breath came in ragged gasps, its golden eyes flickering with pain and defiance. Its powerful limbs twitched as it tried to free itself, but the more it struggled, the deeper the metal spikes dug into its flesh. Daniel's heart pounded. He had rescued bobcats before, but this one was bigger than any he had seen, its fur thick and patterned with wild spots, its muscular frame built for hunting and survival. And yet, here it was, helpless and bleeding. But something else caught his attention. In the distance, barely visible through the haze of falling snow, 5 more bobcats stood motionless. Their sleek bodies were tense, their ears flattened against their heads. Their sharp eyes were locked onto him. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had never seen this before. Bobcats were solitary creatures. They didn't form packs like wolves. Yet these ones, they were watching him. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. Still, there was no time to hesitate. He crouched down beside the trapped bobcat, speaking in a low, calming voice. "Easy now. I'm here to help." The animal let out a guttural snarl, but didn't have the strength to lash out. Blood oozed from the deep cuts in its legs and side. The barbed wire had wrapped cruelly around his body, nearly slicing through muscle. Daniel worked quickly, pulling out his wire cutters. Each snip sent a sharp metallic sound into the still air. The bobcat flinched, its powerful muscles trembling. Behind him, the other bobcats took a step closer. Daniel's pulse quickened. He was used to dealing with wild animals, but this was different. There was intelligence in their eyes, an eerie, almost human-like understanding. They weren't attacking. They weren't running away. They were waiting. For what? His hands moved swiftly, carefully untangling the injured bobcat. Every cut of the wire felt like a race against time. The creature was weak, but its breath was steady. It had a chance, but only if he acted fast. As he removed the last piece of barbed wire, the bobcat let out a deep, shuddering breath. Its massive paws twitched, and for the first time, its body relaxed slightly. Daniel reached for his first aid kit, pulling out antiseptic wipes and bandages. He had to stop the bleeding before the cold finished what the wire had started. Then, a low growl rumbled through the air. Daniel froze. He slowly turned his head. The 5 bobcats had moved even closer. They were now just a few feet away, their sleek bodies barely making a sound in the snow. And then, one of them did something no wild animal should ever do. It sat down, not in an aggressive stance, not ready to pounce. It sat like a house cat, tail wrapped around its paws, its golden eyes staring directly into Daniel's soul. Then another sat, then another, until all 5 bobcats were sitting in perfect formation, watching him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to run. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how wild animals behaved. And then the injured bobcat, the one he had just saved, slowly lifted his head and looked at him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the injured bobcat licked Daniel's hand, a gesture of recognition. The world seemed to stand still. Daniel felt something shift in the air, something beyond logic, beyond nature. He had saved the bobcat's life. But now, standing in the middle of this frozen wilderness, surrounded by these silent, watching creatures, he had the sinking feeling that he had just become part of something much bigger than himself. And he had no idea what was about to happen next. The bitter wind swept across the icy plains, whistling to the towering pines. Snowflakes spiraled through the air, melting the moment they touched the man's warm breath. He shivered, not just from the cold, but from the eerie silence that had settled over the wilderness. He had freed the bobcat, but he wasn't alone. 5 other bobcats stood in the distance, their golden eyes glowing against the snowy backdrop. Their powerful bodies were motionless, muscles coiled tight like springs, watching, waiting. The man, Daniel Carter, felt his pulse pounding in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to be careful. He had seen wild animals react unpredictably before, but never like this. Why weren't they running? Why weren't they attacking? The injured bobcat, still lying in the snow, let out a weak but deliberate sound, a deep, rasping noise that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was the call. Daniel had no time to react. The largest bobcat, easily over 40 pounds, its fur thick and dusted with snow, took a slow step forward. Its breath curled in the freezing air. Then another step. The other 4 followed, their movements eerily synchronized. Predators never moved like this, not unless they were planning something. Daniel's grip on his wire cutters tightened. His mind raced. Was this an ambush? His boots crunched softly against the snow as he shifted his weight. If they attacked, he had no real chance. A single bobcat was dangerous, but 5? He was outnumbered, outmatched. But instead of leaping at him, the lead bobcat did something that sent ice through his veins. It sat down, not in a defensive stance, not crouched for an attack. It simply lowered itself onto the snow, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, staring at him with an expression he could only describe as calculated. Then, one by one, the others followed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't normal. Bobcats were solitary creatures. They didn't hunt in packs. They didn't gather like wolves. And they certainly didn't sit in perfect unison like this. He exhaled slowly, his warm breath visible in the air. His instincts had never failed him before. If these bobcats wanted him dead, they would have attacked the moment he freed their injured companion. But they hadn't. Instead, they watched, studied him, as if waiting for something. The injured bobcat let out another rasping breath. It was weak but alive, struggling to rise onto shaky legs. Daniel's got twisted as he saw the deep gashes in its side. It had lost a lot of blood. If he didn't help it soon, the cold would finish what the barbed wire had started. Carefully, he reached into his first aid kit and pulled out a roll of gauze. The 5 bobcats tensed. Daniel froze. His mind screamed at him to move carefully. He had been around animals long enough to understand their signals. And right now, these 5 creatures were on high alert. But they didn't growl, didn't bare their teeth. They just watched. Slowly, deliberately, he unrolled the gauze. The injured bobcat flinched, but didn't pull away. Its golden eyes flicked toward his hands, then back toward its companions. Daniel worked quickly, wrapping the wound with steady, practiced hands. His breath was shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, just as he finished securing the bandage, a sound shattered the silence. A sharp, piercing cry. Daniel's head snapped up. The bobcats all turned in unison, ears twitching. The cry came from deeper in the forest. Faint but urgent. Another bobcat. Daniel's stomach twisted. Was there another one in trouble? Before he could process it, the injured bobcat, the one he had just saved, lifted its head and let out a deep, throaty call in response. The sound was lower, filled with exhaustion but unmistakable. The 5 bobcats reacted instantly. They stood as one. The largest one turned, flicking its tail. The others followed. They were leaving. Daniel exhaled in relief until he realized something. The injured bobcat wasn't leaving with them. It was still beside him, weak, vulnerable, staying. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Was it choosing to remain behind? Did it trust him more than its own kind? Daniel swallowed hard. He had spent years working with animals, but this was different. This felt personal. Then the leader turned back to look at him. A silent exchange passed between them. A strange, unsettling feeling that this was far from over. Then, without another sound, the 5 bobcats disappeared into the swirling snow. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were still shaking. His mind raced with what had just happened. He had saved a wild predator, but in doing so, he had crossed an invisible line, and he had a gut-wrenching feeling that whatever had just begun wasn't going to end here. The world around Daniel was silent, save for the soft whistle of the wind. His breath curled in the freezing air as he stood there, staring at the spot where the 5 bobcats had vanished into the snowy wilderness. But his eyes weren't on the empty horizon. They were on the bobcat still beside him, the one he had just freed. It was injured, trembling, and struggling to stay upright. The fresh bandages he had wrapped around its wounds were already spotted with blood, but the bobcat wasn't trying to run. It wasn't trying to attack him either. It was just there. Daniel swallowed, his instincts warring with his logic. Why was it staying behind? Bobcats were solitary creatures. Even when injured, their survival instincts dictated that they retreat to safety, away from humans, away from threats. But this one, it was choosing to stay. And then a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if it couldn't leave? Daniel's chest tightened. The poor thing had lost a lot of blood. Its body was weak. If it collapsed out here in the cold, it wouldn't survive the night. He took a slow step forward. The bobcat's ears twitched, but it didn't move away. That was a good sign. He crouched down beside it. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure the bobcat understood the tone of his voice, but he knew animals could feel intent. He slowly extended his gloved hand. The bobcat's muscles tensed, but it didn't snarl or swipe. Instead, it simply watched him. Daniel had been around wild animals for years, but this was different. This wasn't just a rescue. This was something else entirely. He reached out carefully, brushing his fingers against the bobcat's fur. It didn't flinch. His heart pounded in his chest. It was letting him touch it. Daniel exhaled, his breath shaky. This wasn't normal. This shouldn't be happening. And yet, here he was, kneeling in the snow, touching a wild predator that should have clawed him to ribbons by now. Then, before he could process it, the bobcat did something that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. It leaned into his touch. A deep, exhausted sigh left the animal's body as it rested its weight slightly against him, as if accepting his presence. Daniel's throat tightened. He could feel the bobcat's body trembling against his arm. It was exhausted, weak, and for some reason, it had chosen to trust him. He knew he couldn't leave it out here. Carefully, he pulled off his backpack and unzipped a side pocket, revealing an emergency thermal blanket. It was designed to retain body heat. Lightweight, but incredibly effective in the cold. He unfolded it slowly, making sure not to startle the bobcat. When he draped it gently over the animal's body, it barely reacted, just let out a slow exhale, its body sinking into the warmth. Daniel glanced at the sky. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, the shadows stretching longer across the snow. If he didn't move soon, the temperature would plummet. His cabin wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute hike, but carrying a full-grown bobcat through thick snow wouldn't be easy. He had to try. With careful movements, he maneuvered himself beside the bobcat, sliding one arm underneath its body. It stiffened, a low, tired growl vibrating through its chest, but it didn't fight him. "That's it," Daniel muttered. "I'm just trying to help you, buddy." He braced himself, then lifted. The bobcat was heavier than he expected, at least 30 pounds, but he adjusted quickly, securing it against his chest. The moment it realized what was happening, it let out a soft, breathy chuff. Not aggressive, not afraid, just acknowledging. Daniel took one step forward, then another, his boots crunched against the snow, his body straining under the unexpected weight. As he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. His eyes flicked toward the tree line, scanning the shadows. The wind whispered through the branches, sending a fine layer of powdery snow drifting through the air. Nothing, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The other bobcats. They had left, but were they still nearby? He couldn't afford to think about that right now. His focus had to be on getting this injured one to safety. Step by step, he made his way through the snow, his arms tightening around the exhausted creature in his grasp. The closer he got to his cabin, the heavier the bobcat felt. His muscles burned, his breath came in sharp puffs, but he refused to stop. Finally, the small wooden structure came into view. Smoke curled from the chimney, the warm glow of the porch light spilling onto the snow. Almost there, he adjusted his grip, shifting the bobcat's weight against him as he climbed the steps to his porch. Reaching out, he grabbed the door handle and pushed it open. The warmth inside hit him instantly. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him, then carefully lowered the bobcat onto a thick blanket in front of the fireplace. The animal let out a soft, tired huff, its body sinking into the fabric. Its golden eyes flickered open for a moment, scanning its new surroundings, before slowly closing again. Daniel exhaled deeply. He had done it, for the first time in hours. His body relaxed. He peeled off his gloves, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. But as he stood there, watching the injured bobcat rest in the warm glow of the fire, one unsettling thought refused to leave his mind. What happens now? This wasn't just a simple rescue. Something else was happening here. And somehow, deep in his gut, he knew the other bobcats weren't done with him yet. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden cabin walls. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, but Daniel couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. He crouched beside the bobcat, watching its slow, steady breathing. It had curled itself into the blanket, its body finally at rest after the ordeal. But something wasn't right. That feeling, the one he'd had while carrying the bobcat home, it was still there. Something was watching. He stood up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkening forest. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the last remnants of daylight slipping away behind the trees. The snow-covered landscape stretched out in front of him, untouched, silent. And then movement. His pulse quickened. There, just beyond the tree line, barely visible against the white snow, they stood. The other bobcats. The ones that had left. The ones that should have been long gone by now. But they weren't gone. They were here. Daniel's breath hitched as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. 5 pairs of golden eyes stared back at him. They weren't growling. They weren't approaching. They were just standing there, watching. Why? His instincts screamed at him to lock the door, to close the curtains, to stay inside. But a different instinct, one deeper, more primal, kept him rooted in place. This wasn't normal. Animals didn't behave this way. These bobcats, they were waiting for something. Daniel turned back to the injured bobcat beside the fire. Its ears twitched slightly, its eyes fluttering open for a brief second before closing again. It was too weak to notice what was happening outside, but the others weren't leaving. Daniel exhaled, forcing his heartbeat to slow. If they wanted to attack me, they already would have. So what do they want? A sudden gust of wind howled against the cabin, rattling the window pane. Daniel took a slow step back, his mind racing. Maybe they weren't here for him. Maybe they were here for the one inside. He turned to look at the injured bobcat again, his gut twisting. If these animals were part of the same family, the same group, then it made sense. They weren't leaving because they knew one of their own was in here. Daniel ran a hand over his face. What was he supposed to do? Let it go? It was too weak to survive on its own. Keep it here? He wasn't sure if the others would allow that. He needed to do something. Slowly, he walked back to the door and gripped the handle. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The cold air rushed in, biting at his skin. The snow outside crunched as he took a step forward. The bobcats didn't move. Daniel swallowed hard. The 5 of them stood still, their sleek bodies barely shifting in the wind. Their eyes locked onto him. Not aggressive, not fearful, just waiting. "I don't know what you want," he muttered under his breath, staring at them. "But I can't let it die out here." A long silence stretched between them. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Then, slowly one of them moved. A large bobcat, bigger than the others, took a single step forward. Daniel stiffened. This one was different, stronger, older. Its muscles rippled beneath its thick fur, its eyes sharp and intelligent. The leader. Daniel had spent enough time around wild animals to recognize dominance. This one wasn't just part of the group. It was in charge. The leader took another step closer, its paws sinking slightly into the snow. Then another, and another, until it was standing just a few feet away. Daniel's fingers twitched at his side. His instinct screamed at him to back up, to retreat. But he didn't move. The bobcat tilted its head slightly, studying him. Then it did something Daniel never expected. It let out a deep, low chuffing sound. Daniel's stomach clenched. That wasn't a threat. That was communication. Bobcats weren't known for social vocalizations, but he had seen this behavior before, between big cats in the wild. It was a sign of recognition, a sign of acceptance. The bobcat was acknowledging him. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He wasn't just some outsider in their territory anymore. They saw him as part of something bigger. His breath came out in shaky clouds. He looked past the leader, at the others still standing near the trees. They weren't leaving. Not yet. Daniel glanced back inside at the injured bobcat, still resting near the fire. And then, without fully understanding why, he made a decision. He stepped back, holding the door open wider. If the leader wanted to see the injured one, if it wanted to come inside, he wouldn't stop it. The leader bobcat's muscles tensed. Its eyes flickered past him, toward the cabin's interior. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then it moved. Slowly, cautiously, the leader stepped forward, one paw over the threshold. Then another. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. The wild animal, this untamed predator, was walking into his home. By choice. The warmth of the cabin brushed against its fur as it moved inside, its gaze locked onto the injured bobcat, its golden eyes narrowing slightly. A deep, throaty chuff rumbled from its chest. And then the injured bobcat responded. It lifted its head weakly, its ears perking ever so slightly. A small, soft chuff left its throat in return. Daniel watched, stunned. They knew each other. The leader moved closer, its massive body lowering beside the injured one. Carefully, it nudged the smaller bobcat's face with its nose. The injured one let out a weak, slow exhale, but for the first time since Daniel had found it, it didn't look afraid. Something inside Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't just an animal rescue. This was a reunion. He backed up slowly, giving them space. The other bobcats remained outside, watching through the open door. They didn't try to come in. They didn't need to, because in that moment, they knew their leader had found the lost one. And Daniel, he had just become part of something far bigger than himself. The warmth of the fire flickered against the wooden walls, casting elongated shadows that danced with every shifting movement. Daniel stood motionless, his breath shallow, watching the leader bobcat crouch beside the injured one. The moment was surreal. This was a creature that should have never trusted him, a wild predator, built for survival, forged by the brutal hand of nature. And yet it had stepped into his home. By choice, Daniel took a slow step back, giving the animal space. The injured bobcat let out a soft exhale, its golden eyes meeting the leader's. They held each other's gaze for what felt like an eternity. There was recognition, there was understanding, and there was something else, something Daniel couldn't quite explain, a connection beyond instinct, beyond survival, beyond anything he had ever seen before. The leader pressed its nose gently against the injured one's head, a deep, guttural chuffing sound vibrating through its throat. The smaller bobcat, still weak, still barely able to move, responded with a faint chuff of its own. Daniel's chest tightened. The leader wasn't just checking on it. It was comforting it. For a brief second, Daniel swore he saw something human in their interaction. Care, loyalty, family. He swallowed hard, unsure what to do next. Outside, the other bobcats remained just beyond the doorway, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding inside. The snow beneath their paws glowed softly under the moonlight, their breath coming in steady, rhythmic clouds. They weren't restless. They weren't impatient. They were waiting. For what? Daniel's mind raced. They could have attacked him by now. They could have torn through the cabin, taken their injured one, and left him in the snow, bleeding. But they hadn't. Instead, they had trusted him. Why? He had spent years in the wilderness, learning, observing, understanding how nature functioned. He had seen loyalty among packs of wolves, devotion among birds that mated for life. But bobcats? They were supposed to be solitary hunters. They weren't supposed to behave like this. Something was different about this group, something he couldn't explain. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching at his sides. His instincts told him that he was standing at a precipice. Whatever happened next would define everything. The leader bobcat let out a low rumble, shifting its weight as it turned its attention to him. Daniel's muscles tensed. It was staring at him now, studying him. He could feel the weight of its gaze, the intensity behind those golden eyes. It didn't see him as a threat, but it didn't see him as prey either. It saw him as something else. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the leader slowly, deliberately, closed the distance between them. Its massive paws moved silently across the wooden floor, the flickering firelight making its fur gleam like liquid gold. It was getting closer. Too close. Daniel forced himself to stand his ground, refusing to move. This was a test. He knew it. Show fear, and he was nothing more than prey. Show aggression, and he was a threat. But show respect? That was the only thing that might save him. He inhaled slowly, steadying his nerves, keeping his posture relaxed but firm. The leader bobcat stopped just inches from him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, it did something Daniel never could have predicted. It lifted its head and brushed its face against his arm. Daniel's breath caught. The sensation was warm, soft. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't dominance. It was acceptance. Daniel felt his entire body freeze as the bobcat slowly, deliberately, rubbed its head against him again. The gesture was unmistakable. It was marking him, claiming him, not as prey, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. Daniel barely had time to process it before the leader bobcat stepped back and chuffed softly. And then, just as silently as it had come, it turned, walking back toward the injured one. Daniel exhaled shakily, his mind reeling. What had just happened? He glanced at the other bobcats outside. They weren't watching the leader anymore. They were watching him. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine, not from fear, from realization. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a bond, a connection between species that had never been meant to exist. And whatever had just been decided in that unspoken moment, it was irreversible, for better or worse. Daniel was now one of them. The night stretched on, the storm outside howling like a restless spirit. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with warmth from a fire, from the lingering scent of pine wood, and from something far more profound. Daniel sat motionless, his mind racing to keep up with the reality before him. He had been marked by a wild animal, by a predator, by something that should have never trusted him. And yet, the bobcat still remained. The injured one was breathing more steadily now, its body curled up near the fire, rising and falling with every slow exhale. The leader bobcat sat close by, watching over its kin like a silent guardian. Outside, the others had settled just beyond the door, their glowing eyes flickering in the darkness like embers. They weren't leaving. Daniel had expected them to take their injured companion and disappear into the wilderness, but they hadn't. Instead, they had stayed. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he was standing at the crossroads of something ancient, something untouched by civilization, something that no human had ever been meant to experience. A pact, a silent agreement between man and beast. He was no longer just an outsider. He was one of them. The morning after, the first light of dawn seeped through the frost-covered window, painting the inside of the cabin in golden hues. Daniel blinked awake, feeling a strange warmth against his side. At first, he thought it was just a fire, but then a soft breath ghosted across his arm. His pulse lurched. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. The injured bobcat had moved closer to him in the night. It was resting against him. Daniel's breath hitched. It should have feared him. It should have avoided him at all costs. But instead, it had chosen to trust him. His fingers twitched, an instinctual urge rising within him. He knew he shouldn't. He knew this was a wild animal, untamed and unpredictable. But still, he lifted his hand, slow, deliberate, non-threatening. And then he touched it. The bobcat didn't flinch. It didn't snarl. It didn't run. It simply lay there, its body warm beneath his palm, its fur thick and soft against his fingertips. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. This moment, it was more than just rare. It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. His fingers gently traced over the bobcat's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of its chest. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir deep within him. Something he had thought was lost. Belonging. An unthinkable act. The leader bobcat let out a soft chuff, drawing Daniel's attention. It was watching him, its golden eyes locked onto his, filled with emotion he couldn't quite decipher. And then it stepped forward. Daniel's breath stalled. The bobcat moved closer, too close. It pressed its massive head against his shoulder, the weight of it grounding him. Daniel went rigid. This wasn't just trust. This wasn't just gratitude. This was acceptance. The leader had made his decision. Daniel wasn't just a human to them anymore. He was something else. And then, as if the moment itself was too delicate to last, the bobcat stepped back. It turned to the injured one, nudging it gently. The smaller bobcat stirred, its eyes fluttering open, its body still weak but stronger than before. The others outside chuffed softly, a quiet communication passing between them. It was time. Daniel knew it before they even moved. They were leaving. The leader bobcat nudged the injured one again, helping it rise to unsteady feet. It turned to Daniel one last time, staring deep into his eyes. And in that moment, an unspoken message passed between them. We remember. We do not forget. And then, just as silently as they had arrived, they vanished, one by one, slipping into the white abyss of the snow, their forms blending into the vast wilderness, until all that remained was silence. The aftermath. Daniel stood at the doorway long after they had gone. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the wind biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was still trapped in the events of the past 24 hours. What had happened here wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. It was something else entirely. Something sacred. His fingers curled, the memory of the bobcats were still lingering against his skin. Would he ever see them again? Would they remember him if he did? Daniel didn't know. But as he looked out into the vast, endless snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. That somewhere out there, hidden beneath the shadows of the mountains, the bobcats still watched over him, still remembered, still knew, and maybe, just maybe, they would return. Some bonds are formed in the most unexpected ways. Some acts of kindness do not go unnoticed. And sometimes, just sometimes, the wild chooses you. The end.